Minor gods, nymphs, satyrs, and centaurs. Minor gods and goddesses also lived on Olympus besides the 12 great ones. The most powerful of them were the goddesses of destiny, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. They were the three fates, and they decided how long a mortal would live and how long the rule of the gods should last. When a mortal was born, Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured a certain length, and Atropos cut the thread at the end of the life. They knew the past and the future, and even Zeus had no power to sway their decisions. Their sister Nemesis saw to it that all evil and all good on earth were justly repaid, and all mortals feared her. Man's creator and his best friend was the Titan Prometheus. Zeus had given Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus the task of repopulating the earth after all living creatures had perished in the early battles of the gods. He gave the two brothers great measures of gifts to bestow upon their creations, and they went down to earth and began to make men and beasts out of river clay. Wise Prometheus modeled men with great care in the shape of the gods. Epimetheus rapidly made all kinds of animals, and without any foresight he lavished the good gifts upon them. When Prometheus had finished shaping man, he found that there were few of the good gifts left. Animals could run faster, see, smell, and hear better, and had much more endurance. Besides, they were kept snug in their warm coats of fur, while men shivered in the cold nights. Prometheus was sorry for mankind, and he went to Zeus and asked him if he might have some of the sacred fire for his poor creations. But Zeus said no, fire belonged to the gods alone. Prometheus could not bear to see his people suffer, and he decided to steal fire, though he knew that Zeus would punish him severely. He went up to Olympus, took a glowing ember from the sacred hearth, and hid it in a hollow stalk of fennel. He carried it down to earth, gave it to mankind, and told them never to let the light from Olympus die out. No longer did men shiver in the cold of the night, and the beasts feared the light of the fire and did not dare to attack them. A strange thing happened. As men lifted their eyes from the ground and watched the smoke from their fires spiraling upward, their thoughts rose with it up to the heavens. They began to wonder and think and were no longer earthbound clods. They built temples to honor the gods, and wanting to share what they had with them, they burned the best pieces of meat on their altars. Zeus was furious when he first saw the fires flickering on earth, but he was appeased when the savory scent of roast meat reached his nostrils. All the gods loved the smell of the burnt offerings. It spiced their daily food of ambrosia and nectar. But Prometheus knew how hard men worked to make their living and thought it a pity that they burned up the best parts of their food. He told them to butcher an ox and divide the meat in 2 equal heaps. In one were the chops and roasts hidden under sinews and bones. In the other were scraps and entrails covered with snow-white fat. Prometheus then invited Zeus to come down to earth and choose for himself which part he wanted for his burnt offerings. Zeus, of course, chose the best-looking heap, but when he discovered that he had been tricked, he grew very angry. Not only had Prometheus stolen the sacred fire and given it to men, he had also taught them to cheat the gods. He resolved to punish both Prometheus and his creations. Cast in unbreakable irons, Prometheus was changed to the top of the Caucasus Mountains. Every day an eagle swooped out of the sky and ate his liver. At night his immortal liver grew anew, but every day the eagle returned, and he had to suffer again. Thus was Prometheus punished, but Zeus found a more subtle way to punish the mortals. He sent to earth a beautiful but silly woman. Her name was Pandora. Pandora was modeled by Hephaestus in the likeness of Aphrodite. He carved her out of a block of white marble, made her lips of red rubies and her eyes of sparkling sapphires. Athena breathed life into her and dressed her in elegant garments. Aphrodite decked her with jewels and fixed her red mouth in a winning smile. Into the mind of this beautiful creature, Zeus put insatiable curiosity, and then he gave her a sealed jar and warned her never to open it. Hermes brought Pandora down to earth and offered her in marriage to Epimetheus, who lived among the mortals. Epimetheus had been warned by Prometheus never to accept a gift from Zeus, but he could not resist the beautiful woman. Thus Pandora came to live among mortals, and men came from near and far to stand awestruck by her wondrous beauty. But Pandora was not perfectly happy, for she did not know what was in the jar that Zeus had given her. It was not long before her curiosity got the better of her, and she had to take a quick peek. The moment she opened the lid, out swarmed a horde of miseries: greed, vanity, slander, envy, and all the evils that until then had been unknown to mankind. Horrified at what she had done, Pandora clapped the lid on just in time to keep hope from flying away too. Zeus had put hope at the bottom of the jar, and the unleashed miseries would quickly have put an end to it. They stung and bit the mortals as Zeus had planned, but their sufferings made them wicked instead of good, as Zeus had hoped. They lied, they stole, and they killed each other and became so evil that Zeus, in disgust, decided to drown them in a flood. But there was one man on earth who had not turned evil. He was a son of Prometheus. His name was Deucalion. Deucalion often went to the Caucasus Mountains to comfort his suffering father. He could not break the chains that bound him, but while he was there he could keep away the eagle that tortured Prometheus. Deucalion was a good son, and his father was thankful for his help. Prometheus, who could look into the future, knew that Zeus was planning to flood the earth. He told his son to build an ark and board it with Pyrrha, his virtuous wife. Deucalion did as his father told him. He built a sturdy ark, and when Zeus let loose all the winds and opened wide the floodgates of the sky, he went aboard with Pyrrha. For 9 days and 9 nights it rained until the whole earth was flooded. Nothing but the highest mountain peaks remained above water, and all mortals were destroyed. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha were saved. They floated in their ark over the deep dark waters. On the 10th day the rain stopped, and slowly dry land began to appear. Deucalion and Pyrrha stepped out of the ark and walked about on the desolate earth. Lonesome and forlorn, they came to a temple grown over with seaweed and entered it. The sacred fire on the altar had gone out, but they lit it again with the embers they had kept glowing aboard the ark, and lifted up their hands in prayer to the gods to thank them for saving their lives. Zeus was touched by their piety and felt sorry for them because they were so lonesome. He spoke to them and said, "Pick up the bones of your mother and throw them over your shoulders." Deucalion understood that Zeus did not mean their mortal mothers, but their mother earth. Rocks were her bones. He told Pyrrha to pick up a handful of stones and throw them over her shoulder while he did the same. Behind Deucalion a score of men sprang up, and there behind Pyrrha a score of women. This new race of mortals was called Deucalion's race. The Deucalion race made from stone was hardier than the one made from clay. The new mortals withstood better the stings of Pandora's miseries, which of course had flown high and dry during the flood and plague mankind to this very day. The winds had carried on as they wished when Zeus flooded the earth. They were powerful fellows, and when they stormed together they brought confusion and destruction, whirling dust and water all the way up to Olympus. Zeus decided that they needed a dependable guardian who would keep them locked up and let out only one at a time. He chose Aeolus, a grandson of Deucalion and Pyrrha, to be the keeper of the winds, and sent him to live with them and guard them in a hollow cliff far out at sea. The winds hated to be confined. They stormed and howled around Aeolus, trying to force their way out of the cavern. But Aeolus was steady and strong and kept them in hand. When Poseidon or one of the other gods called for a wind, Aeolus pierced the wall of the cliff with his spear and let the wind out. Then he plugged up the hole and kept it closed until it was time for the wind to return. When Boreas, the north wind, was called for, he rushed out, icy and wild, tearing up trees and piling up waves in front of him. When noticed the south wind was let out, he pressed himself groaning through the hole in the cliff. He was so heavy with moisture that water dripped from his tangled beard, and he sprayed a leaden fog over land and sea. Wanderers lost their paths, and ships drifted helplessly about. Zephyr, the west wind, was gentler than his brothers. When he blew, he swept the sky clear of clouds, and all nature smiled. Eurus, the east wind, was the least important of the brothers. He wasn't called for often. Eos, gentle dawn, was the mother of the four winds. While all creation slept, she rose from her pink pillows to announce the coming of a new day. She dipped her rosy fingers into a cup filled with dew and sprinkled the drops over flowers and trees. All nature awoke, rejoicing to see her. One morning as Eos looked down on earth, her eyes fell on a young prince waking from his slumber. He was so handsome she could not take her eyes off him, and she wanted him for her husband. But how could she, who was a goddess, be married to a mortal whose lifespan was so short? As soon as her morning duties were done, she went to Zeus and persuaded him to grant eternal life to the young prince, whose name was Tithonus. She brought him with her to her palace in the east, and they spent many delightful years together. But Eos had forgotten to ask that Tithonus be also given eternal youth, and slowly his strength left his once supple limbs. He shriveled and shrank, and his manly voice changed to a feeble squeak. He shrank to a tiny, wizened old man, yet he could not die, for he had been given eternal life. He became so small and weak that Eos had to put him into a little basket and hide him in a corner of her palace. There, in his dark corner, he went on withering and shriveling till at last he turned into a grasshopper, chirping for all eternity. But Io stayed rosy and young, always a joy to behold when she came out to wake the sleeping world and announce the coming of her brother, the sun. Helios, the sun, mounted his glowing chariot and drove out in great splendor as soon as Eos threw open the gates of his golden palace in the east. His radiance lit up the wide expanse of sky. So bright was he that only the gods could look straight at him without being blinded. Brilliant rays encircled his head, and his chariot glowed like fire. With a strong hand, Helios guided his 4 fiery steeds up the vault of the heavens. The path was steep and narrow, and the horses were wild, but Helios held them well on their course. At high noon he stopped at the top of the sky and looked around, and nothing could escape his piercing gaze. Again he drove on, and now he gave free rein to his steeds. Far to the west they could see his glittering evening palace, and eager to reach their stables, they raced on the downhill course, faster and faster. They passed a great herd of white cows hurrying homeward to Helios's palace, and met a large flock of sheep going out to pasture in the sky. For Helios owned a snow-white cow for each day of the year, and a woolly sheep for each night. The shadows grew long and dusk settled over the world when Helios and his foaming team arrived. His 5 daughters, the Heliades, awaited them. They unharnessed the tired horses and let them plunge into the ocean for a cooling bath. Then the horses rested in their stables, and Helios talked with his daughters and told them all he had seen that day. In the dark of the night he boarded a vessel of gold with his team and sailed around the world, back to his palace in the east. The way was far shorter by sea than by air, so he had time to stay for a while in his morning palace too before he set out on another day's journey. Helios had a son named Phaethon. He was a mortal and very proud of his radiant father. One morning, as Helios was about to set off on his daily journey across the sky, Phaethon came to him and begged him to grant his dearest wish. Helios, who was very fond of his handsome son, rashly swore by the river Styx to give him any wish he might have, but when he heard Phaethon's wish, he sorely regretted his oath. He tried in vain to make his son change his mind, for what Phaethon wanted was to drive the sun chariot for one day, and Helios knew that no one but he himself could handle the spirited steeds. Phaethon was determined to have his wish, and Helios had to give in. Sadly, he put his golden rays on his son's head and rubbed divine ointment on his skin so he could withstand the searing heat of the chariot. He barely had time to warn him to stay well in the middle of the heavenly path when the gates of the palace were thrown open and the rearing horses were brought forth. Phaethon leapt into the chariot, grasped the reins, and the horses rushed out. At first all went well, and Phaethon stood proudly in the glowing chariot. But the fiery steeds soon felt that unskilled hands were holding the reins. They veered off the heavenly path and brushed by the dangerous constellations that lurked on both sides of it. The animals of the zodiac were enraged. The bull charged, the lion growled, the scorpion lashed out with its poisonous tail. The horses shied, and Phaethon was thrown halfway out of the chariot. Far down below he saw the earth, and he grew so dizzy that he dropped the reins. Without a firm hand to guide them, the horses bolted. They raced so close to the earth that the ground cracked from the heat of the chariot, and the rivers and lakes dried up. Then upward they sped so high that the earth froze and turned to ice. Zeus stood on Olympus and shook his head. He had to stop the careening chariot to save the earth from destruction, and he threw a thunderbolt at it. In a shower of sparks, the chariot flew apart, and Phaethon plunged into the river Po. On the river banks, his sisters mourned so long that Zeus took pity on them and changed them into poplar trees and their tears into drops of golden amber. Hephaestus had to work the whole night through to mend the broken chariot so Helios could drive it again the next day. Helios grieved over his lost son, and he never again allowed anyone to drive his chariot except for Apollo, the god of light. Selene, the moon, came out at night to light up the world while her brother, Helios, was resting. Slowly she drove her milk-white horses across the sky, and her pale moonbeams fell gently on the sleeping earth where all was peace and quiet. One night Selene's soft light fell on Endymion, a young shepherd who was sleeping beside his flock. She stopped to look at him. He was smiling in his sleep and was so young and handsome that she completely lost her heart to him. She drove through the night, but she could not get him out of her mind. When her duties were over, she went to Zeus and asked him to grant Endymion eternal sleep so he would stay forever young and handsome. She had learned from her sister Eos not to ask for eternal life for a mortal and be left with a grasshopper on her hands. Zeus granted Selene's wish, and Endymion slept on, smiling in his sleep. He dreamed that he held the moon in his arms, but it was not a dream after all, for Selene bore her husband 50 daughters, all pale and beautiful as their mother and sleepy as their father. In Selene's magic light, river gods rose from silvery streams to inspect their riverbeds, and hills trembled under the hooves of the wild centaurs. Laughing nymphs and bleating satyrs danced to the music of Pan, god of nature, master of them all. Pan, the great god of nature, was not a handsome god. He had goat's legs, pointed ears, a pair of small horns, and he was covered all over with dark, shaggy hair. He was so ugly that his mother, a nymph, ran away screaming when she first saw him. But his father, Hermes, was delighted with the strange looks of his son. He carried him up to Olympus to amuse the other gods, and they all laughed and took him to their hearts. They called him Pan and sent him back to the dark woods and stony hills of Greece as the great god of nature. He was to be the protector of hunters, shepherds, and curly-fleeced sheep. Pan was a lonely and moody god. When he was sad, he went off by himself and hid in a cool cave. If a wanderer happened to come upon him and disturb him in his retreat, he would let out a scream so bone-chilling that whoever heard it took to his heels and fled in a fear that they called panic. But when Pan was in a good mood, and that was mostly on moonlit nights, he cavorted through glades and forests and up steep mountain slopes playing on his shepherd's pipe, and nymphs and satyrs followed dancing behind him. Sweet and unearthly were the tunes that floated over the hills. The satyrs much resembled their master, Pan, but they were mischievous and good for nothing except for chasing nymphs. Old satyrs, or Selene, were fat and too lazy to walk. They rode about on asses, but they often fell off, since they were fond of drinking wine. The light-footed nymphs always looked young, though some of them were very old in years. Their lifespan was so lonely that they were almost immortal. They lived 10,000 times longer than man. There were water nymphs and nymphs of mountains and glens. There were nymphs who lived in trees and nymphs who lived in springs. When a tree grew old and rotted, the nymph who lived in it moved to another tree of the same kind. A wood chopper about to fell a healthy tree must remember first to ask permission of the tree nymph. If he did not, she might send out a swarm of bees to sting him, or she might turn the axe in his hands so he would cut his own leg instead of the tree trunk. A thirsty hunter must never drink from a spring without asking the water nymph's permission. If he ignored the nymph, she might send a venomous water snake to bite him, or she might poison the water and make him sick. River gods, too, had to be asked before anyone took water from their rivers. They were usually helpful and friendly to men and willingly shared their water, but woe to the one who tried to carry off their water nymph daughters. They would rush out of their river beds and charge him in full river god rage. They were dangerous opponents, for they grew ox horns on their heads and could change their shapes at will. Zeus himself feared their rage, and Pan and the satyrs kept well out of their way, though Pan liked all nymphs and fell in love with many of them. Echo was one of the nymphs with whom Pan fell in love. She was a gay nymph who chattered and prattled all day long and never kept quiet long enough for Pan to win her with music and poetry. One day Hera came down from Olympus to look for Zeus. She suspected that he was playing with the nymphs, but Echo detained her so long with idle chatter that Zeus, who really was there, was able to sneak away. Hera, in a rage, punished Echo by taking from her the gift of forming her own words. From then on, poor Echo could only repeat the words of others. Now at last Pan thought he could win her by his words, but before he had a chance, she had lost her heart to another. He was Narcissus, and he was so handsome that every girl and every nymph he met fell in love with him. Unfortunately, he liked nobody but himself. Echo trailed silently behind Narcissus as he hunted in the woods, hoping to hear an endearing word from him that she could repeat, but he never so much as noticed her. At last toward nightfall they came to a quiet pool, and as Narcissus was thirsty, he bent down to drink. Suddenly he stopped and stared, for in the mirroring surface of the water he saw the handsomest face he had ever seen. He smiled, and the handsome face smiled back at him. Joyfully he nodded, and so did the stranger in the water. "I love you," said Narcissus to the handsome face. "I love you," repeated Echo eagerly. She stood behind him, happy to be able to speak to him at last. But Narcissus neither saw nor heard her. He was spellbound by the handsome stranger in the water. He did not know that it was his own image that he had fallen in love with, and he sat smiling at himself, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink, until he wasted away and died. Hermes came and led him down to the realm of the dead, but where he had been sitting the lovely narcissus flower sprang up. Echo stood beside the flower and grieved and pined until she too faded away. Nothing was left of Echo but her voice, which to this day can be heard senselessly repeating the words of others. Pan grieved for a while, but then another pretty nymph crossed his path, and he forgot all about Echo. Her name was Syrinx. Syrinx ran away from Pan. She thought he was so ugly. Pan chased after her, and, to escape from him, she changed herself into a reed. She stood among hundreds of other reeds on the riverbank, and Pan couldn't find her. As he walked through the reed patch, sighing and looking for her in vain, the wind blew through the reeds. They swayed and bent and made a plaintive whistling sound. Pan listened, enchanted. "Thus you and I shall always sing together," he said. He cut 10 reeds into unequal lengths, tied them together, and made the first panpipe. He called the new instrument his syrinx, for every time he played on it he thought he heard the melodious voice of his beloved nymph. Again Pan was lonesome, and he retreated to his cool cave, deep in the woods, and scared away all passers-by with his unearthly screams. Splendid Apollo himself fared no better than Pan when he fell in love with a nymph called Daphne. Daphne had a cold heart. She had vowed never to marry, and when Apollo wooed her, she would not listen to the sound of his golden lyre and ran away. As she fled, she was lovelier still, with her golden hair streaming behind her, and Apollo could not bear to lose her. He set off in pursuit, beseeching her to stop. Daphne ran toward the bank of a river that belonged to her father, the river god Ladon, calling to him to save her from her pursuer. Ladon had no time to rise out of his riverbed and come to his daughter's rescue, but the moment Daphne's toes touched the sand of the riverbank, he changed them into roots. Apollo, who was close at her heels, caught up with her, but the instant he threw his arms about her, her arms changed into branches, her lovely head into the crown of a tree, and she became a laurel. Still, inside the hard bark, Apollo could hear the beating of Daphne's frightened heart. Apollo carefully broke off some twigs and made a wreath of the shining leaves. "Fair nymph," he said, "you would not be my bride, but at least consent to be my tree, and your leaves shall crown my brow." Ever after, the greatest honor an artist or a hero could be given was to be crowned with a wreath from Apollo's sacred tree, the laurel. Daphne would rather be an unmoving tree than the bride of the great god Apollo, but all the other nymphs loved to sit at his feet and listen to his enchanting music, and were very honored when he or any of the other great Olympian gods chose one of them as a bride. The wild and vulgar centaurs did not honor any of the gods. They were half men and half horses, as cunning as wild men and as savage as untamed horses. They had inherited the worst dispositions of both. The first centaurs had come tumbling out of a cloud with their father, Ixion, king of the Lapith people, had married, mistaking it for the goddess Hera. Zeus had created the cloud to test the ungodliness of the wicked king who wanted to carry off Hera. Ixion was severely punished for his ungodliness. He was condemned to whirl about forever in the underworld, tied to a flaming wheel, but his offspring, the centaurs, remained on earth as a scourge to the Lapith people. The centaurs lived without law and order, stormed over fields, trampled crops, and carried off the Lapith women, and they ate raw meat. The young centaurs were no better than their elders. They were poorly brought up by parents who kicked them and spanked them and left them to fend for themselves. There was one centaur who was kind and wise and was fond of children. His name was Chiron. Though he looked like the other centaurs, he wasn't related to them at all. He was the son of Cronus the Titan and was immortal. Chiron was famous as the greatest teacher in Greece. Kings brought their small sons to him so he could raise them in the true spirit of heroes. In his quiet cave on Mount Pelion, he taught them manly sports and how to use the healing herbs of the earth and how to read the stars in the sky. All his pupils returned to their homes exceeding their fathers in courage and knowledge. One day Apollo brought to Chiron his little mortal son, Asclepius. His mother, a Lapis princess, had died, and Apollo asked Chiron to raise the boy. Asclepius grew up in Chiron's cave, raised with loving care, and being the son of Apollo, he soon surprised his foster father in his knowledge of healing the sick. When he was grown, he left Chiron's cave and went down from the mountain to help the people of Greece. He became the first great physician. People flocked to him from far and near, and many who came on crutches went away skipping and dancing. His patients adored him and showered treasures upon him, and it wasn't long before they worshipped him as a god and built temples in his honor. Asclepius put beds in his temples, and they became the first hospitals. There he went about from bed to bed, pleased to be looked upon as a god, leaning on a staff entwined with sacred serpents. Serpents knew all the secrets of the earth and often told him the causes and cures for diseases. Sometimes he put his patients to sleep with a magic draught and listened to what they muttered in their dreams. Their words often revealed to him what caused their ailments, and he could then find a cure for them. Asclepius had a wife and 7 children, and all the children followed in their father's footsteps. His sons were his assistant physicians, his daughters were his nurses. Hygeia, one of his daughters, washed and scrubbed her patients from morning to night, and it was a marvel to see how fast they regained their health. Before Hygeia's time, it was thought that soap and water would kill the sick. Asclepius grew famous, rich, and pink-faced, and as time went on, he grew so skilled in his art that he could even bring the dead back to life. The Fates became upset and complained to Zeus that they measured and clipped the threads of life in vain. Hades, too, was angry, for he was being cheated out of dead souls. Apollo pointed out to Zeus how much good his son was doing for mankind, and for a while Zeus was lenient. But when Asclepius accepted gold for bringing the dead back to life, Zeus hurled a thunderbolt at him. Nothing but a small heap of ashes was left of Asclepius, the first great doctor. But his temples and his teachings of medical science remained, and the gods put his image among the stars as a constellation. Apollo was furious with Zeus for killing his son and wanted revenge. He did not dare to raise his hand against his mighty father, but he slew the Cyclops who had given Zeus the thunderbolt. Zeus, in his turn, had to revenge the Cyclops. He punished Apollo by making him serve for a year as a slave on earth. Apollo found a good master and suffered no hardship, but the gods on high Olympus missed him and his music, the 9 muses most of all.